I want you to sit with a number for a second. 48 hours. That is all that separates the world's most critical shipping lane from potentially going dark, again, and two nuclear-armed militaries from resuming active hostilities. As of right now, the temporary ceasefire between Washington and Tehran is set to expire on Wednesday evening, Washington time, and neither side is showing any sign of blinking first. Here is what caught my attention when I started pulling the threads on this story. On Friday, Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi announced the Strait of Hormuz was fully reopened to commercial traffic. Brent crude instantly cratered, dropped 10% in a single session, dipping below $90 a barrel for the first time in 5 weeks. Markets exhaled. Investors moved money back into equities. For about 12 hours, it looked like maybe, just maybe, there was a path to de-escalation. Then Saturday happened. Tehran reversed the decision, reimposed restrictions on the waterway, and accused the United States of only partially implementing the ceasefire by maintaining its own naval blockade of Iranian ports. By Sunday, a U.S. destroyer had fired live rounds into an Iranian cargo ship, and Marines had rappelled onto its deck from helicopters. In the space of 72 hours, we went from cautious optimism to the most dangerous maritime confrontation since this war began in late February. That whiplash tells you everything about where this crisis actually stands, and it is a lot worse than the headlines suggest. So let me walk you through the diplomatic collapse first, because the sequence matters. President Trump posted on Truth Social on Sunday that his representatives were heading to Islamabad, Pakistan, for another round of negotiations. Vice President J.D. Vance was supposed to lead the delegation, with Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, and son-in-law Jared Kushner rounding out the team. The White House framed it as the decisive moment, the final push. Iran's response? A categorical rejection. IRNA, that is Iran's official state news agency, published a statement saying Tehran would not participate in a second round of talks. The reasoning was blunt. Washington's excessive demands, unrealistic expectations, constant shifts in stance, repeated contradictions, and the ongoing naval blockade. They went further than just declining. Iranian media called the entire American narrative around the talks a media game, a pressure tactic dressed up as diplomacy, designed to shift blame onto Tehran when the ceasefire collapses. What I find worth noting here is the language Iran's foreign ministry spokesman Esmail Baghai used on Monday. He described the U.S. naval blockade as unlawful and criminal, and said it amounted to, and I want to be precise about this, a war crime and crime against humanity. That is not the kind of language a government uses when it is quietly keeping the door open for back channels. That is the language of a country preparing its domestic audience for what comes next. Now, behind the scenes, there are mixed signals. Iranian sources had told CNN that a delegation was actually expected in Pakistan by Tuesday, and Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif spoke with President Pezeshkian by phone on Sunday. Sharif's readout of the call made no mention of Iran pulling out, so there is a gap between what Tehran is saying publicly and what may still be happening through intermediaries. But that gap is shrinking by the hour, and the seizure of the Tusca may have closed it entirely. Now here is where this story pivots from a diplomatic breakdown into something kinetic and genuinely dangerous. On Sunday, the guided missile destroyer USS Spruance intercepted the MV Tusca, an Iranian-flagged cargo ship, nearly 900 feet long, in the northern Arabian Sea. The Tusca was heading toward Bandar Abbas, Iran's primary commercial port, and according to CENTCOM, the ship had been warned repeatedly. The crew refused. So the Spruance fired several rounds from its 5-inch Mk-45 deck gun directly into the Tusca's engine room, disabling the ship's propulsion. Marines from the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, launching from the amphibious assault ship USS Tripoli, then rappelled from helicopters onto the deck and took custody of the vessel. Trump confirmed the seizure on Truth Social, writing that the Tusca tried to get past our naval blockade, and it did not go well for them. He added that U.S. Marines now have custody of the ship, and that it is under U.S. Treasury sanctions because of their prior history of illegal activity. According to Marine traffic data, the Tusca's last port of call before the intercept was Port Klang, Malaysia, on April 12th. Before that, the ship had been shuttling between the Chinese city of Zhuhai and various Iranian ports. The vessel's owner, Mossacar Darya Shipping Company, based in Tehran, has been under U.S. sanctions since 2012. This is the first time the United States has actually boarded and seized an Iranian ship since the blockade began on April 13th. Before this, CENTCOM says it had turned around 25 commercial vessels, but firing on one and physically taking it, that crosses a threshold. Tehran's Joint Military Command, Qatam al-Anbiya, immediately accused the U.S. of violating the ceasefire and labeled the operation armed piracy. They did not just condemn it, they issued a direct warning that Iran's armed forces will soon respond and retaliate. When you consider that Iran's ambassador to Pakistan, Reza Amiri Moghadam, had already been saying things like, America cannot flout international law, intensify its illegal blockade, and still masquerade as a genuine diplomatic partner. This incident fits a pattern of grievances that Tehran has been building toward for weeks. The Tusca was the match. The blockade was the fuse. Now I know some of you are going to say, well, the ship was sanctioned. The U.S. had every right to stop it. And on paper, sure. The Tusca and its parent company have been on the Treasury Department's sanctions list for over a decade. But here's the problem with that framing. You cannot maintain an active naval blockade of a country's ports, fire on its merchant vessels, and then simultaneously claim you are engaged in good faith diplomacy. Those two things are structurally incompatible. And I think both sides understand that, which is why I want to be honest about something I have been watching develop over the past 2 weeks. Neither Washington nor Tehran is actually negotiating in the traditional sense. What we are watching is a parallel track where both governments are using the language of diplomacy to position themselves for the breakdown they both expect. Trump is making offers he knows Iran will reject. Shipping enriched uranium to the U.S. was called a non-starter by a senior Iranian official within hours of Trump floating it, and then pointing to the rejection as justification for escalation. Iran, meanwhile, is setting conditions it knows the U.S. will not meet: immediate lifting of all blockade activity, security guarantees against future Israeli and American strikes, war reparations, and then citing American refusal as proof of bad intentions. Iran's top negotiator, Parliamentary Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, actually acknowledged this dynamic himself. After the first round of Islamabad talks, he told state media, "We have had progress, but there is still a big distance between us." That is a diplomat's way of saying the gap is not closable on this timeline. And the timeline is everything. The ceasefire expires Wednesday. European allies are reportedly worried that Washington's negotiating team is pushing for a swift, superficial deal that grabs headlines but leaves the hard work for later. This is not a peace process. This is a countdown. Let me put some numbers on why all of this matters beyond the geopolitics. The Strait of Hormuz, in normal times, handles more than 20% of the world's daily oil supply. Since the war began on February 28th, it has been effectively shut. On Monday, just 3 ships were recorded crossing the waterway, down from hundreds per day before the conflict. The market reaction has been violent. Brent crude surged past $95 a barrel on Monday, and by Thursday, it was flirting with $100. At its worst point during this war, Brent briefly broke above $119. U.S. crude has followed a similar arc. On the day of the Tusca seizure, WTI jumped nearly 7%. Wholesale gas prices climbed 4%. Heating oil futures, which track jet fuel costs, spiked 5%. Iran's first vice president, Mohammad Reza Aref, laid out Tehran's position on this in remarkably transactional terms. He said the choice was straightforward: either a free oil market for all, or the risk of high costs for everyone. He framed the strait's reopening as conditional on what he called a guaranteed and lasting end to the economic and military pressure against Iran and its allies. That framing is important because it means Iran is explicitly using Hormuz as leverage, and they are telling you they are doing it. This is not speculation. This is stated policy. And the longer the strait stays closed, the worse the downstream effects get. Over 20,000 seafarers are currently stranded on hundreds of vessels stuck in the Gulf. India has summoned Iran's ambassador over shooting incidents involving Indian-flagged tankers. UK maritime agencies have reported IRGC gunboats firing on a tanker attempting passage. This is not a localized standoff anymore. It is a global supply chain crisis with no exit ramp in sight. So where does this leave us? I will give you my honest assessment. The ceasefire expires in approximately 48 hours, and there is no framework in place to extend it. Iran is publicly refusing to negotiate. The United States is physically boarding Iranian vessels. Oil markets are pricing in prolonged disruption. And the one mediator both sides trust, Pakistan, is watching its diplomatic capital erode with every news cycle. I think the most likely outcome at this point is not a dramatic military escalation, though that risk is real and rising. I think the most likely outcome is a controlled deterioration. The ceasefire lapses. Both sides engage in limited provocations. More ship seizures, more Hormuz restrictions, maybe targeted strikes on peripheral assets, while keeping the door technically open for a third round of talks. Neither government wants a full-scale war, but neither government can afford to be seen backing down. Trump told Axios on Sunday he was optimistic and said the concept of the deal is done. That may be true in his view, but a concept is not an agreement. And between now and Wednesday evening, the distance between those two things is measured not in diplomatic cables, but in 5-inch naval rounds and repelling Marines. Keep your eyes on two things this week. Whether an Iranian delegation materializes in Islamabad despite the public denials, and whether Brent crude breaks $100. Those two indicators will tell you more about the real trajectory of this crisis than anything either president posts online. I am Jay. That is the situation as it stands right now.